And welcome back to The Price of Business. I'm your host, Chris Kelso. And right now on air, we have Jonathan Bydlak. Jonathan, how you doing?
I'm great. How are you, Chris?
Doing very well, thank you. You know, for all those first-time listeners, let us know who you are and what you do, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. My name is Jonathan Bydlak. I'm the president of the Coalition to Reduce Spending. We are basically the only national organization that advocates exclusively for cutting government spending as a means of balancing the budget.
You know, that's a very interesting subject right now because obviously we just got through going through the fiscal cliff. We had a Band-Aid again put on something, if you ask me, and some things that I disagreed with in the whole thing. You know, where do we stand right now? What can we do, and what is, from a coalition perspective, how can we educate our general American as to what needs to go on and why is it so important to balance the budget and to go through a reduced spending initiative?
Yeah, that's a loaded question. I mean, the big problem with the fiscal cliff legislation that no one's really talking about is the fact that it actually increased spending. Everyone's been sort of fiddling about, what's going to happen with regards to tax rates on the wealthy, without realizing that we actually increased spending, according to a Washington Times article, by about $330 billion over 10 years. So, this is of course our constant frustration is that when push comes to shove, actually getting meaningful spending cuts is very difficult. Our belief at the Coalition to Reduce Spending is that ultimately, just to rely on a couple of politicians to do the right thing is not really the way to change the status quo. And so one of the things that we promote is what we call a Reject the Debt pledge, which basically asks candidates for office to pledge that they will only vote for balanced budgets, that they won't vote to increase borrowing, and I think most importantly that they won't vote for any new spending programs that aren't offset elsewhere in the budget, which, that's a framework that I think is very critical because, you can sort of say, well, all right, if you want to add some new spending program that you think is great, go ahead, but you need to cut somewhere else. And that, I think, is something that Washington has failed to do for forever, pretty much. Well,
and one of the things I always tell everybody is, as a father, I lead by example. As a nation, we need to lead by example. As a politician, we need to lead by example. I doubt very seriously a lot of these individuals are running their households and teaching their children to manage their own budgets on a micro perspective the way we are on a macro level right now. And that's probably one of the biggest things that I tell everybody is we need to get back to basics. We need to get back to a balanced budget. We need to get back to showing the American public of how to truly run a country as a corporation. Companies don't survive if they're run like the U.S. government is.
That's right. Yeah, Chris, I guess you got to get a printing press for your household. But I think you're right, and I think one of the questions that I'm often asked is sort of how do you win this battle? And the thing that I like to point out is that, common sense is on the side of cutting spending, right? If you go into the average coffee shop and you say, you're spending $10,000 a month and you're only making $5,000 a month, what do you need to do? The average person isn't going to say, well, I need to go to my boss and ask for a raise, right? They kind of realize that at its core, they need to make, a substantial reassessment to what they're spending their money on. And so the problem really comes from the fact that people don't always make the connection between what they would do in their personal lives to the public life. And I think that has a lot to do with misinformation and the fact that the incentives of politicians are such that there really isn't much of an incentive on either side to, provide good information and to have, the general public understand how this works. And so a lot of what we're trying to promote is to say, look, I mean, the same principles that would apply to, as you said, your family or your business are the principles that we should be applying at the federal level with respect to the federal budget.
Absolutely. And we're not, and that's a shame. And you mentioned also something, unfortunately, I hate to say it, is the politicians in general, everyone that we have up there right now. I mean, I'm a big believer of a couple items. Number one is I'm a big believer of term limits. I think we need to get out some of our old-timers that we have up there, and I'm not talking about age perspective, I'm talking about time perspective, and start refreshing it with a new wave of individuals who are truly committed to showing how you can run a country the right way, more importantly, in a balanced budget way, and we don't have that right now. We have a lot of individuals up there who are used to the Washington way of doing business. They're used to kicking the can down the street per se, letting future generations take care of it. The problem is those future generations are the same individuals who are making the decisions today that they were making the decisions 20 years ago.
Right. That's exactly right. And it's interesting that you point out the example of term limits because, when term limits spread as a nationwide movement in the 1990s, the way that happened was by getting candidates for office and elected officials to publicly go on the record and say that they were going to, enforce term limits on themselves. Basically make a pledge to voters that they were in favor of term limits. And that model, I think, is something that should be applied to the spending issue, right? Rather than having candidates run for office and say, oh, I'm for small government or I'm for tackling the national debt, and then, of course, they get into office and they vote for the first big spending bill that comes up to a vote. What we're saying is let's get people to sign on the dotted line so that when they say, all right, I'm in favor of smaller government or I'm in favor of solving our debt problem, we're going to define very concretely what that means for them. And it's those three things that I mentioned earlier: no unbalanced budgets, no new spending programs that aren't offset, and no new borrowing. So that now, when politicians get into office, and then they violate that pledge to voters, there's a means for voters and for the press and for activists to hold them accountable. And that, I think, is what really needs to happen, is that it's not just a matter of electing new people. It's a matter of changing the incentives in such a way that elected officials are on the record so that you can hold them accountable.
Yeah, and that's part of the problem. None of them want to go on the record about anything that can put their own jobs in jeopardy right there.
Well, it's a track record kind of thing. It's like financial commentators who go on TV and say, the housing market's going to do this or the stock market's going to do that, and who really goes and checks out the track record to see whether these people on TV are right. The same thing goes on with politicians. They run for office and they say X, Y, or Z, and then they get into office and no one really goes and holds them accountable in an effective way. We got
a couple more minutes. Let me know a little bit about what you think the effect is going to have on this last vote. Obviously, spending has been increased. Obviously, we've kicked the bucket down the road a little bit more right now. We've actually increased taxes. A big article came out the other day in reference to the Tea Party movement about how some of the Republican Party candidates are really going to pay the price for their voting. How do you see this playing out going forward?
Yeah, so the basic situation is that the spending cuts that were supposed to occur on January 1st have now been pushed off for 2 months. And the rationale that's been given by Mitch McConnell and the Republicans is that, all right, we dealt with the tax side of the equation, now we're going to deal with the spending side of the equation. Now, I will say that I'm somewhat skeptical about their ability to do that, and in fact, Nancy Pelosi has already said that the next round of negotiations should include further revenue increases. The reality about the tax increases that occurred on in the January 1st deal is that they're really insignificant from the context of solving our budget problem. The amount of money that's raised is in the tens of billions of dollars when we're talking about a $1.3 trillion budget deficit. So, it's hard to say how things will exactly pan out, but my guess is going to be that it's going to be very close to how it's always panned out in the past, which is that people don't want to cut their pet projects, and cutting spending is very difficult because each politician has their sort of thing that they don't want to address. And so, whether it's entitlement spending on the left or anything related to the Pentagon on the right, that's what makes it's those sacred cows that make cutting spending so difficult. And so perhaps we're going to get some spending cuts around the margins. But I think in terms of addressing the things that actually make up the bulk of our budget, I think it's going to be, we'll see, but color me skeptical.
Well, Jonathan, I appreciate you being on board today. Let everybody know how we can reach you if you don't mind.
Yeah, definitely. Visit our website, reducespending.org, and you can sign our voter pledge and learn more about what we're about and send us your thoughts.
That is Jonathan Bydlak. Jonathan, thank you very much. For all those listening, remember, go out there, check out reducespending.org. Great organization right there. I'm coming up against a break right now, but stay tuned. We'll come back for our last segment in 1 minute.